Hello and welcome to Dialogue. As the Israel-Iran conflict continues, civilian deaths are mounting and the threat of a wider war is growing, with Washington weighing its next move and Europe, China and the Arab world all speaking out. Is the region sliding toward a full-blown crisis? What's the latest on the conflict and who, if anyone, can stop it? Join us for today's discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me for today's show are Professor Peter Kuznick at American University, Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, and Mark Seddon, Director of the Center for UN Studies at University of Buckingham. He was also the former speechwriter for UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Welcome to Dialogue. Well, Zhou Bo, I will start with you. If you take a look at the Iranian attitudes right now, they demonstrate the defiance against the threat or the pressure from either Israelis or the Americans. In response to Trump's demand for unconditional surrender, Iranian leader Khamenei and Iranian officials have issued basically messages that Iran will respond firmly to attacks. They will never surrender. What do you make of this defined stance?
Well, how can a country like Iran just surrender because of Israel's air attack or bombing on these nuclear facilities, right? And for Iran to surrender, the Israeli troops have to move in, which is not easy at all because they're not neighboring countries. And Iran is such a large country, more than 60 times bigger, than Israel. So just the bombing itself can hardly resolve this problem. Probably we only have one example that air bombing could resolve the problem, such as the one that was done by NATO in Kosovo many years ago. Mm-hmm. So normally by just airstrikes themselves, you can hardly resolve an issue. And Iran, because of its proud history, is of course a proud nation. And this would just make them all the more determined to fight back. But of course, it remains to see how they could actually do that, because it's not only about the resolve, it's also about how many missiles they have and how many interceptors Israel would have, right? Because they reportedly have 2,000 cruise missiles, which they have consumed about 400. But then how many interceptors does Israel have? That is a big that is actually a military secret, because Israel would not tell that. So the war probably will at least drag on for quite some time to come.
Yeah, until both sides probably use up their, let's say, ammunition?
Well, I think the most important thing is about missiles, because they are not neighboring countries. So for Iran to attack Israel, they have to use cruise missiles. They had about roughly 2,000, right? Mm-hmm. But then how many have they used? And could they produce more? And how quickly could they produce? All these are big problems.
Mm-hmm. Let's also take a look at the attitudes from the Israeli side. Mark, what we have seen is like the Israeli side is also kind of like shifting their, let's say, goals or demands at least. So Prime Minister Netanyahu broadened his demands for Iranian capitulation, moving beyond calls to dismantle the Iranian nuclear program. Now he's insisting, Iran scrap its ballistic missile arsenal. And of course, he's also calling for Iranian people to rise up against the government. So sort of like he's moving from destroying the nuclear, facilities to regime change. How do you view these demands?
Israel is engaged in yet another war whose ends are not known, whose aims are not known, or weren't at the beginning. But of course, we do know that Netanyahu has spent his whole political career preparing for this moment. He's been arguing for regime change in Iran for 40 years. And of course, he did the same with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So, yes, this is what he wants. I think it's worth remembering in all of this that the United States were actually in the middle of negotiations with the Iranians, and that when Netanyahu attacked, he killed the Iranian's chief negotiator. And I think it's also worth remembering that Israel has nuclear weapons, it has biological and chemical weapons, and indeed once threatened to use them back in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. This is clearly an existential struggle for both Netanyahu and the Iranian leaders now. I don't see personally, and I'm no expert, by the way, on the military and what have you, but I don't see that Netanyahu has any intention of backing down. And I think his ultimate aim is to involve the United States. And then, of course, this is when it becomes horribly unpredictable because anything can happen.
So you are saying that he's aiming at United States. You mean by dragging the U.S. into the war, right?
Yes, I mean, I think it's been very clear for a very long time that Netanyahu has wanted the United States to join with it in toppling the Iranian government. And of course, taking to pieces the nuclear program. By the way, as we know from Tulsi Gabbard, who is, of course, one of Trump's ministers, and from her intelligence department, US intelligence, as recently as March, they were saying there is no evidence that Iran is making a nuclear weapon. Now, Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as you know, and it is not currently making nuclear weapons. The real risk, of course, now is that the Iranians, even if their sites are severely damaged, will leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty and will perhaps seek, like North Korea has, to get a nuclear weapon. This is what happens when we leave the world of an international rules-based order and go to the law of the jungle. And this is where we're at.
Well, this is where we are. Peter, of course, as Mark has said, the Israelis launched the attack on the Iranians, 2 days ahead of a new round of negotiation between Iran and the United States. So some say, is the true purpose of Israelis is to stop the nuclear agreement between U.S. and Iran. People also pointed out that Netanyahu is the key figure behind Trump last time around for the U.S. to basically withdraw from JCPOA, a nuclear agreement with Iran. So he's now trying to destroy another agreement. What do you make of that kind of criticism?
Well, that's absolutely true. Netanyahu was strongly opposed to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that Obama signed in 2015. He came to the United States and lobbied the Congress against it. Then he applauded and he pushed Trump to rescind that in 2018 when Trump destroyed the JCPOA. As the IAEA, every expert was saying, the JCPOA, the original deal, was working brilliantly, perfectly. They were having hundreds of inspections of Iran's nuclear facilities, including surprise inspections, and Iran was abiding by it. Again, Iran wanted a deal. The problem was the stupidity of the U.S. negotiating position with Iran. Everybody knew that the red line that Iran could never accept was that it would have zero enrichment. As a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran has the right to enrich uranium. And so they could never go along with Trump's demand for zero enrichment. And they knew that. So it was never an honest negotiation. But still, they were making progress and they were continuing to meet. And so when Israel feared that they would eventually come up with a resolution of that, and has decided to preempt that by bombing, not because it was a threat. Netanyahu says that Iran posed an existential threat to Israel. Iran did not pose an existential threat. As Mark was saying, all the evidence was that Iran did not have a nuclear program, that Iran was still a long way from a deliverable weapon. But now it's probably, if I were an Iranian leader, from a nationalist perspective, there'd be a good chance that I would now rush to develop nuclear weapons. So the whole thing is absurd. untruthful. It's very similar to what happened in 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq based on lies. This again is a situation based on lies, no evidence, false allegations, and a situation that should never have come to this kind of resolution, this kind of a war there. It was so unnecessary and so potentially dangerous.
But though, a good point, Peter, there. You know, if you take a look at the 2003, the time prior to the Iraq invasion, illegal invasion, let's say, the U.S. tried to get approval from the UN Security Council. But this time around, basically, there's no need to go through the UN Security Council. And it's really the decision by Donald Trump. Despite the fact that the Tulsi Gabbard, intelligence director of the United States, she said, as Mark said, Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, and also the IAEA director, Gross, also said they didn't find any evidence that Iran is systematically developing or producing a nuclear bomb. So these facts, and also the consideration of whether it's legal or not, these are not into the consideration of the U.S. decision-making process?
No, all the evidence showed that Iran was not developing a nuclear bomb. The most interesting thing about Tulsi Gabbard was not just her late March testimony and continued insistence, but she released a 3.5-minute video just a couple days before Israel started this war, in which she warned about the imminence of nuclear war and the threat, and talked about nuclear winter and how dangerous the situation is. And I'm convinced that Tulsi knew that this attack was coming, and she was trying to preempt it by talking about the possibility, because we don't know where this is going to end. Israel does not have an end game strategy. Clearly, Trump has no strategy. Trump agrees with the last person he speaks to on every issue, and he's on all sides of every issue. However, the U.S. is deploying so many military assets to the region that it's clear that Trump is preparing for U.S. even greater involvement. The U.S. has been involved from the beginning. It greenlit this whole situation, and it gives Israel intelligence, and it provides defense to Israel against Iranian incoming missiles. So U.S. has been very much involved from the beginning, but it could get much more involved, which is likely, and start bombing Fordo, and then Iran could hit U.S. facilities in the region, and this could expand into, we don't know what could happen, a regional war, even a global war.
Right. Zhou Bo, of course, if you take a look at the discussions, among the, let's say, in the United States or in general, Western scholars, a few people mention the legality issue, whether, let's imagine, let's assume there's the involvement of the United States. A few people discuss whether it's legal or not, whether that's a violation of international principle, international law. Well, do you think we are going to have a replay of 2003, like Iraq invasion?
Well, certainly, Israel's attack on Iran is in violation of the international law, right? This is clearly an invasion of one country into another country.
Right.
Yeah. And if the United States get itself involved, of course, this is another invasion. But of course, this now remains a problem. But the tricky thing is, if they just want to bomb Fordo, the so-called nuclear facility deep on the ground, then it has to be done by American aircraft, which is a B-52, and it has to be done by American pilots. Yeah, because Israel doesn't have a B-52, and it doesn't have this kind of bombs that can actually destroy any facilities deep on the ground. So this would be a very difficult decision for Trump to make, because they have to, first of all, bomb it to make a hole, and then the other, B-52 will come in to just drop bombs on the same hole to make it bigger, so as to destroy the whole thing. So whether the United States would involve or not, we don't know. But it's interesting for me to read actually editorial in the New York Times today. Actually, people always ask the question whether Trump would give an order to be involved in the war or not. And according to New York Times, this is the wrong question because actually he needs permission from the Congress, right? So
Well,
things are just becoming more complicated.
probably he has enough support in the Congress. Republican control the Congress, right? So that's why people are thinking about Trump, making a decision. Of course, in terms of making decision, obviously we are seeing, Mark, there are people, I would say strong opposition. Maybe there are minority group of people inside this MAGA group, right? Tucker Carlson, for example, Steve Bannon, they are, speak loudly against another war involving the United States. What's the factor, probably most important factor somehow, in the mind of Donald Trump that he's yet to make a decision?
Well, I mean, you're asking me to try and read the mind of Donald Trump.
Very difficult,
I mean, Donald Trump can't read his own mind, I'm afraid. So, as Peter was saying, I just want to say something really briefly about the Security Council and international law, if I may, before I answer your question, because that is a very, very important point. There appears to be no attempt to be taking this to the Security Council, presumably because everybody knows that this would be an illegal act. And Israel has already acted illegally. In fact, today, the British Attorney General has told the British government that involvement of the British in a military assault on Iran with America could be against international law as well. So, this time we haven't even got the pretense of weapons of mass destruction because there aren't any there. We had in the run-up to the Iraq war, the dossier that was waved around, which said that there were weapons of mass destruction. We know that there weren't. Now, when it comes to opposition, well, look, Peter's probably got a much better feel than I have, but it's clear that, President Trump, his political career, really, and who could have thought that he could ever have had a political career 10, 20 years ago, but it sort of came as something out of the blue, as a real prospect when he was involved in those candidate debates with Jeb Bush back in, I think, 2016, 2015. Yeah. And he attacked the Bush legacy for war. And that actually gave Trump a huge amount of support amongst a lot of American voters who have become very weary of lots of endless wars in the Middle East. And so Trump does risk, obviously, antagonizing a significant part of his base. And he's clearly upset the MAGA crowd. And so you have this extraordinary situation, it seems to me, in the American political sphere where you've got the left wing of the Democratic Party, which has always been consistently against illegal wars, Bernie Sanders and others. You've got the MAGA crowd also against this possible war coming up. And we've got the neocons with the Democratic Party establishment, who's thus far not saying very much at all. Perhaps this could be the point when the Democratic Party establishment, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton and others, but I say no. But I would defer to Peter on that.
Yeah, Peter, please.
Well, I wouldn't put much faith in what the Hillary Clintons are going to say and do. Mm-hmm. That's a very hawkish wing of the Democratic Party. Barack Obama had a little bit more enlightenment when it came to the Iraq war. He said he didn't like dumb wars. He didn't object so much to other wars. And then Biden, when Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, we all hoped that Biden was going to restore it, but he didn't. So it's sad to see that the neocons, the hawks, who took over the Republican Party under George W. Bush, now have migrated largely to the Democratic Party. And so you've got a big pro-Israel faction in the Democratic Party, the traditional Republicans and some Trumpies supporting the war and Israel in the Republican Party. And this bizarre phenomenon now, as Mark was saying, you've got the progressive Democrats, and you've also got a lot of these MAGA Republicans. Even a Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, I can't agree with on very much, but she's been very outspoken.
Hmm.
I was on Tucker Carlson's show not long
Yeah.
ago, and he is passionately concerned about the threat of nuclear war, and he's very much opposed to U.S. military interventions around the world. So, that's putting a lot of pressure on Trump because that's an important part of his base that would be furious and would possibly bolt from him and from the Republicans if they go ahead and get the U.S. involved in another Mideast war,
Hmm.
especially one that so reminiscent of 2003, with the possibility of regime change, like in Libya. When you look at what's going on in Libya now, where you've got chaos, you've got civil war, you've got warlords, and the result of the U.S. overthrow of the leaders in Libya was that the weapons have spread throughout the Sahel,
Right.
throughout parts of Africa, and created more crises there. And so, we don't know what would happen
Hmm.
if the U.S. gets involved or if Israel really tries to have regime change.
Right. Let's take a look at of course, the other parties. Zhou Bo, for example, Russia. Russia is telling the U.S., not to strike Iran because it would radically destabilize the Middle East, according to their deputy foreign minister, Ryakov. And of course, Moscow also said Israeli strikes risked triggering a nuclear catastrophe. Obviously, there's Russian opposition. But how much, in what way, or will that kind of opposition count in terms of this, the whole process of getting more
Well,
risk in it?
I think Russia's statement would be inconsequential, either for Israel or for the United States. I think people have just now talked about the difficulties Trump might have should he decide to be involved, right? But that is how the United States might think about it. So it should have nothing to do with how Russia would condemn it. Yeah. Given what Russia has been doing in Ukraine, would it really matter that much what Russia said, except when it gave seeing world threats on using nuclear weapons? That certainly has worked. Yeah, in preventing NATO troops setting the feet on the Ukrainian soil. So I don't believe that it would really matter much. Still, it is up to Israel, first of all, to decide. Netanyahu has said that this war has actually changed the face of the Middle East. In a way, yes. I think in a way they're just becoming bolder because they certainly have drawn their own conclusions from the attack over Hamas. Right now, Hamas is basically destroyed. Hezbollah is much reduced. Syria has changed government. The whole situation looks somewhat favorable to Israel. But if Israel continues, to the extent that this becomes a wider war, I'm not so sure that it will definitely be in interest of Israel.
Well, Mark, let's take a look at the European response. French President Macron warned the biggest error would be to use military strikes to change the Iranian regime because it would then be chaos. But German Chancellor Merz seems to take a different attitude. He said that Israel was doing the quote-unquote dirty work for its Western allies. And so what do these responses reveal about Europe's position?
Well, I have to say that statement from the German Chancellor was possibly one of the most disgraceful and disgusting things that I've heard from a Western politician in my life, actually, because what he's saying is that it's quite acceptable for the UN Charter to be broken and for all sorts of illegal acts to be undertaken by Israel, and we'll just let them get on with it and do nothing, or we might get involved. No, I think the European response has been very poor, and there's another sense of deja vu as well, because around about the time of the Iraq War, the French were giving the impression that they were very concerned as well, and they didn't want it to go ahead. And it's the same with President Macron. I mean, to a degree, he is playing both sides. Don't forget this. past week there was supposed to be the Saudi-French UN conference on the possibilities for ending war in the occupied Palestinian territories and recognition for Palestine. So that was dropped immediately the attacks on Iran started. What we saw, I think, in Canada at the G7 was also a really quite enfeebled response by the European Union and by Britain and by Canada to President Trump, who they desperately wanted to get on side for all sorts of different reasons, but who left the meeting early, as you know. What they managed to produce at the end was a communique which said that effectively Israel has the right of self-defense. Well, I mean, this was just literally after Israel had launched an attack on Iran. So, and of course, the European Union has talked about the need for de-escalation and the need for negotiations to begin once again. But I don't think clearly President Trump takes the European Union particularly seriously. The European Union leaders take themselves quite seriously. But that's about it, frankly. I mean, the European Union could have had a much greater degree of influence, in my opinion, if they'd taken a much stronger line at the beginning over Gaza, and also made very clear to President Trump about the need to take all of this to the Security Council and then the importance of international law. You cannot, as the West has done throughout my life, talk about the international rules-based system and then preside over it being ripped up and then telling other countries what they must do. I think it's become very hollow now, and I think the Global South has noticed. And I think also the Arab world, really, which has failed the Palestinians throughout all of this, needs to take some notice, because what we're not talking about is the influence that Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states could have over President Trump if they but used it. Even Egypt, which has been behaving so weakly. All of these countries need now to be putting maximum pressure on President Trump and the Israelis.
Well, Zhou Bo, earlier you mentioned about the landscape of the Middle East is changing. In a joint statement led by Egypt, so 21 Arab and Muslim countries condemned Israel's airstrikes on Iran and called for regional de-escalation. President Xi Jinping of China and also spoke to Putin of Russia. They called for ceasefire, stressed the importance of regional peace and stability. Otherwise, the entire world will be affected. You agree? I mean, if the chaos, if the conflicts continue, basically the rest of the world, directly or indirectly, will be probably not at peace, probably.
You see, the best thing for Israel is that people stick to Abraham Accord, but apparently this is already blown, right? And this war actually has united the Arab world, which actually was somehow split, between countries who are pro, Sunnis or who are pro Shia. Because even if they have some kind of a disagreement towards Iran, but this time clearly this is a Muslim country, and clearly this is such an outright invasion. So you will now find the Arab world speaking very much in the same voice. Talking about China's attitude, I'm sure this is no doubt a very kind of a crystal clear Chinese policy.
Well, on that note, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qianduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.